Every military action looks chaotic from the outside. A unit advances when it seems like it should hold. A commander retreats when he appears to have the advantage. An airstrike hits a target that seems strategically irrelevant. A ceasefire gets agreed the moment one side looks like it's winning. None of it makes sense until you understand the actual logic driving those decisions, because these calls aren't made the way most people think they are. They aren't made on the basis of what's happening on the battlefield. They're made on the basis of what commanders believe is happening, filtered through incomplete information, institutional pressure, political constraints, and the psychological reality of people making life-and-death choices under extreme stress. Once you understand that filter, the decisions start making sense, every single one of them. Let's get into it. The first thing to understand is that no commander has accurate information, ever. This sounds obvious. The implications are profound. Every decision made in combat is made on the basis of a mental model of the battlefield, not the battlefield itself. Commanders receive reports from subordinates. Those subordinates received reports from their subordinates. Each step in that chain introduces delay, interpretation, and error. By the time information reaches the decision maker, it is already old. The enemy unit that was in position X when the report was filed has moved. The friendly unit that was advancing has stopped. The bridge that was intact has been destroyed. The commander is always fighting the last known state of the battlefield, not the current one. Professional military training is largely about making good decisions despite this problem, not solving it. And here is why this matters for understanding what you see in news coverage. When a military operation appears to make an inexplicable decision, the most common explanation isn't incompetence. It's that the decision-maker had a different picture of the battlefield than the one you're seeing from satellite imagery and open-source reporting. He wasn't making a bad decision given what he knew. He was making a reasonable decision given a picture of the battlefield that was wrong. This is the first driver. Every decision is only as good as the picture it's based on. And the picture is always incomplete, always delayed, and always filtered through the people reporting it. Stay with me, because the second driver is the one that explains most of what looks politically inexplicable. Commanders don't just respond to the enemy, they respond to their own chain of command. Every military operates within a hierarchy. Orders come down, results are reported up, careers are made and ended based on those reports. And that structure creates pressure that shapes decisions in ways that have nothing to do with what's actually happening on the battlefield. A commander who reports failure accurately risks his career. A commander who reports partial success, emphasizing the gains, minimizing the losses, protects himself within the system. This isn't unique to any one military. It exists in every hierarchy. But it compounds in warfare in a specific way. When commanders routinely report optimistic pictures upward, the senior leadership makes decisions based on a systematically distorted view of reality. Operations get extended past the point where they're viable because the leadership genuinely believes the situation is better than it is. Reinforcements get sent into failing operations because the reports say the operation is on the verge of success. Withdrawals happen later than they should because nobody in the chain wants to be the one who reported the bad news that triggered the retreat. This is not a theory. It is what happened in Vietnam, where optimistic reporting sustained an unwinnable strategy for years past the point where the evidence on the ground made continuation viable. It is what happened in Afghanistan, where progress metrics were systematically reported upward in ways that made the situation look better than it was, until it wasn't. It is what happened in the opening months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Senior commanders received reports suggesting the operation was progressing on schedule. Outside Kyiv, columns of vehicles sat stationary with empty fuel tanks. The battlefield and the briefing room were describing different wars. One of those descriptions was driving the decisions. Stay with me, because the third driver is the one that changes how you read every statement made by any military in any conflict. Every military action has two audiences, the enemy and everyone else. What a military does on the battlefield sends a message, not just to the force it's fighting, to its own population, to allied governments, to neutral countries watching the outcome, to future adversaries calculating what this military will and won't do. This is called signaling, and it shapes combat decisions in ways that are completely rational from a strategic perspective but look completely irrational if you're only watching the tactical situation. Why does a military continue an offensive that is clearly stalled? Sometimes because they believe they can still succeed. Sometimes because stopping sends a signal of weakness that costs more strategically than the tactical losses of continuing. Why does a military accept a ceasefire when it appears to be winning? Israel did this repeatedly in conflicts with Hezbollah. From the outside, stopping while ahead looked like strategic weakness. From the inside, continued fighting meant more civilian casualties, more international pressure, more economic cost, against an adversary that could rebuild and fight again in years. The ceasefire preserved the gains without paying the escalating price of consolidating them. The tactical picture said, keep going. The strategic calculation said, stop. The battlefield calculus and the strategic calculus are running simultaneously. Commanders are making decisions in both at the same time. When a decision looks tactically irrational, the explanation is almost always in the strategic calculation that isn't visible in the battlefield reporting. Here's where these three drivers combine into something that explains a pattern you'll see in every modern conflict. Information is incomplete, hierarchies distort it further upward, and every decision is being made for multiple audiences simultaneously. The result is a decision-making environment where the rational choice, the one that makes sense given all the constraints, often looks wrong to anyone watching from outside those constraints. The unit that retreats when it could hold is responding to orders based on a strategic picture the unit commander doesn't have access to. The airstrike that hits a seemingly irrelevant target is sending a signal to an audience that isn't on that battlefield. The operation that continues past the point of obvious failure is running on reports that say it isn't failing yet. None of these are failures of logic. They are the logical output of a system operating under the constraints that every military operates under. Understanding this changes how you read combat reporting. When a military action seems inexplicable, the question isn't what went wrong. The question is, what information did the decision-maker have? What pressure was the hierarchy applying? And what signal was the decision designed to send? Answer those three questions, and the decision stops being inexplicable. It becomes the only decision that made sense given those inputs. Here's what this means practically. Every time you see an advance that stalls, a withdrawal that comes too late, an escalation that makes things worse, the real story is in the gap between what the decision-maker believed and what was actually true. That gap is almost never visible in real time. It becomes visible later, in memoirs, in after-action reports, in the accounts of commanders who were there and can describe what the picture looked like from inside the decision-making process. Almost every major military failure in history looks inevitable in retrospect. At the time, it looked like a sequence of reasonable decisions made by competent people working with the information they had. That's not a defense of those decisions. It's the most accurate description of how they were made. And understanding that process, the incomplete information, the hierarchical distortion, the dual audience of every decision, is what separates an accurate analysis of a conflict from a narrative that explains complex military decisions as simple failures of courage or competence. The logic is almost always there. It's just not the logic you can see from the outside, which is exactly why understanding it changes everything about how you follow a conflict from the moment it starts. This framework doesn't require access to classified information. It requires asking the right questions about every operation you follow in the news. What did the decision-maker know at the time? Not what you know now from the reporting that came after. What was his hierarchy telling him he needed to deliver? Who else besides the enemy was he talking to with that decision? Those three questions dissolve the confusion in almost every military decision that looks inexplicable in real time. The next time a military decision doesn't make sense, hold that thought. Then ask what the decision-maker knew, what his hierarchy needed to hear, and who else he was talking to besides the enemy. The answer will be there. It usually is.